Okay. The Lottery, originally published in The New Yorker in 1948, is a classic piece of literature that details the dangers of tradition. I remember reading this piece by Shirley Jackson in, I think it was like 8th grade, which is really wild when we get into what the actual subject matter is. First of all, children reading this is probably not the best idea, or maybe it's a great idea, actually, now that I think about it. But the biggest theme is what can happen if we are unwilling to change, if we are unwilling to progress, if we are unwilling to do the right thing when other people are saying, hey, that's not the right thing to do. For my deep dive here, I want to highlight a couple of aspects, and I do have notes, which you can see by my little tiny little sticky notes here, of character names. I also have annotations throughout, so I will be referencing those as well. But we have a couple of key players here in this story that I want to highlight. We have Mr. Summers, Tessie Hutchinson, Old Man Warner, Mrs. Delacroix, who is the fakest friend you'll ever have, and Mrs. Dunbar. The story begins very unassumingly, but Shirley Jackson actually plants the seeds of discomfort very early on. In the second paragraph, Shirley Jackson references the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them, which is in reference to the school children who are now on break from their studies. But if we want to think about it a little bit deeper and a little bit differently, it's that sense of unease that just pervades when you know something's not right, even though you've been told your entire life that it's fine. Enter in Mr. Summers, who is the new tradition keeper, so to speak. He is the person who has taken up the mantle, even though they know it's probably not the right thing to do, but for the sake of tradition and for continuation, they do it anyways. It was really interesting. As you can see, I've annotated this story, like, seriously annotated it. Villagers are wanting to keep their distance from the tradition. So Mr. Summers brings in a black box filled with these slips of paper for the lottery. And at this point, the reader has no idea what is going on. They don't know what the lottery is or what they're going to be doing. They just know that it is something that everybody participates in every single year. But it is interesting to me that Shirley Jackson states here, the villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, which is where the box was sitting. And when Mr. Summers said, some of you fellows want to give me a hand, there was a hesitation before two men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. I thought that was so cool because it shows clearly how hesitant and how afraid the citizens are of continuing on this tradition, how absolutely terrifying all of this is. But when you're prodded and when somebody you know and respect takes the lead, you tend to follow them, as shown with Mr. Martin and his son Baxter. I thought that was super cool. Moving on down, Shirley Jackson really tries to drive home the dangers of pursuing tradition for no reason other than the fact that it is just tradition. And that is highlighted in this next paragraph better than I could ever put it. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, who, by the way, is the symbolism of embodiment of tradition, and this is his 77th lottery. 77. The oldest man in town was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make the village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything's being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stained. I really want to unpack that because that's such a cool and important exposition dump. So as I mentioned, Old Man Warner is the embodiment of tradition. He is somebody who wants to continue on no matter the cost, no matter what it looks like, no matter how anybody feels about it. He says we have to keep tradition because it is tradition and tradition is established for a reason. That's Old Man Warner's role. What I think is really interesting is Shirley Jackson highlights that the original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago. They do not know why they're continuing this tradition. Even the original intent of the tradition has been lost at this point, but they just keep doing it. They keep following the footsteps along that are presented to them because tradition demands it. I think it's really cool how the new embodiment, the person who has taken up the mantle of continuing on the tradition, Mr. Summers, wants to create a new box, which to me is communicating, hey, I see some problems with this tradition. And it's saying, let's keep it, but let's tweak it. Let's change some things, which he does get away with. He has gotten rid of the wood chips that were previously used, and instead he's put in slips of paper with a marking of coal on them. So he has done minor changes and tweaks, which I think is really interesting because in real life, as tradition is passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation, we change things. So let's take a smaller example. Christmas. My family for Christmas has this tradition called Santa Bingo. Every Christmas Eve or somewhere around there, my dad will dress up as Santa. He will buy all of these gifts from the dollar store and we will play a game of bingo to win all of these gifts. Now, as this tradition has continued, even within this first generation of it even existing, it has changed every single year. All of the gifts are wrapped the same. That has never changed. They're all wrapped in the same paper. Recently, the rules have evolved. Typically, if you would get something edible or wearable, only you would have to wear it. If you unwrapped something that you had to eat, you had to eat it. But the rule recently changed that if you get something to eat, everybody has to eat it. See what I'm saying? Things evolve and change without even meaning to, just to enhance the tradition. I think it's really interesting that Shirley Jackson highlighted in here how Mr. Summers is wanting to change things, potentially to even make them better. But with old staunch traditions, you're going to be stonewalled probably quite a bit. It's pretty common actually, and we can look at this in a political light. I'm not going to make a political statement, but we can definitely see some very clear examples in the political sphere and kind of what that leads to if things are not willing to be changed. Let's continue. I think that there's this really cool theme as well within the lottery of how tradition can haunt you. The box never goes away. Even after it's done, even after the whole ceremony has taken place, the ritual has taken place, the lottery has been conducted, the box never goes away. It spends the rest of the year with somebody or somewhere. There was a point that it was even in a grocery store, just hanging out, like always that permanent reminder that, hey, this is going to be coming up and hey, you better be ready for it. Enter in the symbol of human nature, Tessie Hutchinson. While Mr. Summers is conducting the ritual and the tradition and saying, hey, let's move on with this so we can get back to work, which by the way is absolutely insane. If I was about to conduct the lottery, like knowing what this is, and that was my main goal, was like, hey, let's get back to work, guys. Let's wrap this up. Okay. I find it really interesting when Tessie Hutchinson arrives. She's making jokes. She's being very relaxed. She's talking to Mrs. Delacroix saying, oh my gosh, I forgot what day it was, ah ha ha. And then when Mr. Summers said, hey, we thought we were gonna have to continue on without you, she's like, oh my gosh, did you expect me to leave my dishes in the sink? Like, treating everything very casually. When I was growing up, I thought, oh my gosh, she's the villain. Because I was in 8th grade and I didn't know any better. But I'm like, oh, she's the villain. She is the problem with society. She is the one. Not so. Tessie actually really reflects, I think, how most of us would react in a situation like this when it's presented, with a few exceptions. But you never know what you're going to do in a panic situation until you're faced with it, right? So let's keep that in mind as we continue on. So Mrs. Hutchinson is making jokes. It's her family's time to draw the lottery. So she's like, oh, Bill, get on up there. Like, making it funny and not taking it very seriously. During that joking, we get some exposition from some of the townsfolk and Old Man Warner, where some of the townsfolk are saying, oh, like some places have already done away with the lottery, and oh, the North is talking about doing away with the lottery. The North. And Old Man Warner which that is his character name. I don't Old Man Warner, so stuck in his ways, is talking about how nothing is ever good enough for these young folk and how they're going to suggest living in caves and nobody wants to work anymore. And my goodness, can you see the parallels between today and 1948? So one of the things that Old Man Warner says is there's always been a lottery. And I think that that's so haunting. And he disapproves so heavily of how Mr. Summers is conducting the lottery, which I think is super funny to me because it's like, but he's continuing on the tradition, but he's not doing it in the way that Old Man Warner would have done it. So I think that that's funny too, because you see these issues as well in modern day where people are continuing on old traditions, but the older generation disapproves because things have been embellished or differentiated or enhanced. And well, it's not the way that it was. So I just thought that was a fun little detail. I really liked that. Enter in Mrs. Dunbar, who I think also represents humanity. So we have two extremes of humanity. We have Mrs. Hutchinson and Mrs. Dunbar. Mrs. Dunbar had to draw for her husband because he was at home with a broken leg, but he still was not exempt from the lottery. She still had to draw a slip of paper for him, etc., etc. And her child, by the way, still had to draw, but he could not draw on behalf of her husband because he was only 16. I don't know the rules. We only know as much as Shirley Jackson allows us to know, which I think adds to the whole mystique of what the tradition and the ritual actually is, because at this point, the society doesn't even know. So why should we? So Mrs. Dunbar, as they're nearing the close of the names to be called for the lottery, tells her son, hey, get ready to go, run home and tell your father the results. So she's really nervous. And I think that Mrs. Dunbar represents news media and gossip in a way. So after the final name is called, and after we find out who won the lottery, which by the way, was the Hutchinsons. So it's no longer funny to Tessie what's going on and how everything is happening. And she's in a whole tizzy about it. Mrs. Dunbar tells her son to go run and tell her father. Now, I thought it was funny and interesting, and I want to pose this question to you guys. Why did she do that? He did not win the lottery. Nobody in his family won the lottery. So why does he need to be informed at this particular moment? I feel personally like Shirley Jackson was critiquing newspapers, which again is really funny considering that this was originally published in the New Yorker. What an icon, right? But I think it's really interesting how she's critiquing potentially news media and how quickly we have to know the news and how we just demand it immediately and how we have to always be informed about what is going on and other people's business and not allowing them to deal with the grief and deal with the things that they know are going to happen to them. But instead, we insert ourselves into their situations and their issues. But I don't know, I could be completely wrong. It could be argued, I guess, that she was so relieved that she's like, oh my gosh, like go and tell my husband, go and tell your father that we made it another year. We did not win the lottery this year. I don't know. I'm not convinced. I don't know. What do you guys think? So as I said, it was all fun and games for Tessie like 3 minutes ago, and now she's like, you didn't let my husband pick the paper he wanted. He was rushed, and everybody saw that. And of course, everybody is telling her to be a good sport, especially her friend, Mrs. Delacroix. Be a good sport. And Mrs. Graves is like, we all had the same chance, Tessie, like calm down. And her husband is like, shut up, Tessie, like literally says, shut up, Tessie, which I think is wild. But, you know, he's in a state of shock. Maybe that's the reason. I don't know. And what's funny about all of this, right? And for me, it's shocking. And even as a child, this was so shocking. You clearly see this person is very upset. And they're telling her like, hey, be a good sport, you know, knock it off, stop fussing. Mr. Summers is like, okay, guys, that was done pretty quick. Like, let's hurry up so we can go back to work and wrap this up. Like, completely ignoring the actual mental meltdown that Tessie Hutchinson is having. I'm just completely beside myself. Like, he is so jaded and detached from everything going on around him. And I think that's kind of the point, is he knows that this isn't the right thing to do. But he's so detached because it's just what always has happened. And he has chosen to ignore it and be like, okay, this is just something that we do no matter what it looks like or how it is. So something that Mrs. Hutchinson does that I think really solidifies that she is the feral reaction. I do think Mrs. Dunbar is the representation of what it is like when something horrible does not affect us, how we're like talking about it and we're like, oh my gosh, like what do we do? You know, like, oh, this is so horrible, but not doing anything about it. And then there's Mrs. Hutchinson, who is desperately fighting for her life by wanting to sacrifice her own child. It's not funny. It's not funny, but she tries so desperately to get her married daughter to draw on her behalf, to slim out the odds of herself winning the lottery. But since her daughter is married, she has to draw with her own family. So womp womp, Tessie, like you gotta face the music. And that's pretty much what they tell her. So she is desperately grasping at straws. And all of that being said, she does have 3 other younger children that live there. So that does slim out her odds a little bit, but she's not satisfied with that. She wants another buffer in there to protect herself. Mrs. Hutchinson keeps saying, I think we should start over. Like, this wasn't fair. You know, you didn't give him enough time to choose, Mr. Summers. And this is just, you know, totally not okay and completely unfair. And she's casting like literal proverbial stones. One thing that I struggled with a lot during this reading is trying to find the rules. So there, like I said, the Hutchinsons have 3 children. Nancy is 12, and that is explicitly mentioned that Nancy was 12 and her school friends breathed heavily and they were really nervous and I hope it's not Nancy and, you know, all this stuff. And then Bill Jr. is younger as well. We don't know how old he is, but it's hinted at that he's like an awkward teenager. And then there's little Dave, who needs help from another adult to participate. So one could assume that he's like below the age of 7, 6, something like that. Which is just wild to me. So the little babies draw their papers. As Nancy's school friends are hoping that Nancy is not the one to win the lottery, Old Man Warner makes a comment about how people aren't the way that they used to be. So there is this disagreement with empathy and contesting traditional values and views, which I think is really strange. Mr. Warner is literally the paragon of tradition in this story. He literally does not think that anybody should have any attachment to anyone in this society because we have to adhere to this tradition no matter what, because society will fall apart without it. Except it won't, because there's other societies that have done away with this tradition. But he just can't see that. He says this is always the way it's been. There's always been one. This is my 77th lottery. And it's never affected him outright. He's only benefited from it. So of course he's going to agree with the tradition. All the Hutchinsons undo their paper and it's very dramatic. The children are safe. And then Tessie is called to open her paper and she doesn't. Bill opens his paper, it is blank. Tessie opens her paper and there is a black charcoal dot in the middle of it, denoting that she has won the lottery. And this, my dear listeners and readers, is where we find out what the lottery is. As Mr. Summers says, okay guys, let's finish this quickly, which, by the way, I'm curious why there's such a rush. Mr. Summers seems to be like the one who has willfully taken up the mantle of tradition and wants to continue or embellish or do small changes here and there to the tradition to otherwise enhance it, because he doesn't have any intentions of destroying it or getting rid of it. But he wants to finish this quickly. He wants to be done with it, which to me communicates that he knows this is not the right thing to do. When you do something quickly, if you're being forced to make a decision, you don't have time to think about it. Your logic does not kick in. It is only fight or flight reflex at that point, as you are struggling and trying to figure out what to do, and you're panicking and you're like, oh my gosh, okay, I picked the red pill. I picked the blue pill. Like, you have no time to decide. You have no time to logically think through what you're actually going to do and what the repercussions could be. So I found that fascinating, because I think that was Shirley Jackson's intention, was, guys, let's finish this quickly. Let's get back to work. Let's pretend like nothing happened until next year. Let's just keep going. It's the way it's always been. Back to it, we do find out what the lottery actually is in these last final paragraphs here. Let me read them to you. All although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. Can you imagine my shock as a literal child in literal 8th grade middle school in my little uniform reading this and saying, huh? I was mortified. I had no idea what this was leading to. But the moment I read that, my stomach sank. And it is such an excellent, hold on, let me get into that. At the beginning of the story, these little boys had collected a big pile of stones, had them piled up, and we didn't know why until now. Now we know why. So our favorite fake friend, Mrs. Delacroix, comes in, selected a stone so large, she had to pick it up with both hands. And she turned to Mrs. Dunbar and said, come on, hurry up. I knew she was fake the minute I sniffed her out. I was like, something right with you. Mrs. Dunbar, the representation of society when it does not affect us, has small stones in both hands. And she said, gasping for breath, I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you. Which I think was so smart and further backs up that claim of what she represents. I really do believe that she is what a lot of us are, where we watch the news and we look at these tragedies and we see things that are happening and we don't do anything about it. But we make ourselves feel better by saying, well, I didn't throw a stone. I didn't do that. Mrs. Dunbar is not running to complete the lottery, but she does have stones in her hands. Now, granted, they are small, so realistically, they're not going to deal as much damage, but they are still stones nonetheless. When people don't do anything and they see awful things happening, we convince ourselves it's fine. We convince ourselves, well, I'm not actively participating in this, so I'm not hurting anybody. But that's still a stone. It's a small one, but it still makes an impact. The saddest part, I think, of this whole story is, remember like the below 6-year-old I mentioned, Davy, he is given a few pebbles in his hand to help participate in the lottery, which is horrifying. This is showing very clearly how early we can damage and indoctrinate young ones into a horrific way of life and teach them this is normal, this is fine, this is the way society functions. It's okay to throw the stones. Even if it's your family member, they're wrong, and this is the way that we have to do things. As a child reading this, it didn't register, but as a almost 30-year-old woman, it hits really hard. So Tessie continues on saying this isn't fair. And then we finally, if you haven't guessed already what is going to happen to Tessie, what the lottery is, what the winner gets, we are told here, a stone hit her on the side of the head. Old man Warner was saying, come on, everyone. Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers with Mrs. Graves beside him. It isn't fair, it isn't right, Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. That's a gut punch if I've ever heard one. Shirley Jackson wrote an incredibly important piece of literature. If you haven't read this story for yourself, it's extremely short. It is literally 13 pages long on the New Yorker. Like, I printed it out. It is 13 pages long with the like artwork title screen. It is 12 pages if you do not print that. It is a 20-minute read to read it aloud. Please read it. It's so cool and it's so genuinely very important, especially in today's society. I do want to hammer home some of my key points. Old Man Warner being the staunch tradition and the pervasive villain or vehicle of the story was really helpful to the reader and very helpful to add symbolism and full structure to the entire world and realm of what exactly was going on in this town. Tessie is feral humanity. Tessie is literally grasping at straws when you are being directly affected by something absolutely horrible happening. But before then, the complete embodiment of jaded, uncaring nature. It didn't matter until her family, and more specifically, she was affected by it. She was affected by the tragedies, and no one was there for her. in the end. As she speaks out, and I think that this is one of the most important parts of the story, and I think this really does make it a very political, which if you didn't catch the fact that this is a very political piece, it is an extremely political piece, but it is also a very feminist piece, which maybe you did not catch the first time around. But I think that it's important to note that the victim of the lottery is a woman. As she speaks out, she is quite literally silenced by her friends, her family, and the government, being Old Man Warner and Mr. Summers. I mean, it's a statement. It is definitely a statement, and I applaud Shirley Jackson for being brave enough to make that statement. My dear readers and listeners, I would encourage you to read this piece. Please read it. It is so excellent and so scary, like genuinely so terrifying. And take a look at the world around you and let me know below how many parallels you see between today and the lottery of 1948. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.